master's program. So Caroline, if you, oh, it's already there. We are on air already. Are we, Caroline? Yes. So hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I'm Igor Castellano. I'm professor at the Federal University of Santa Maria in Rio Grande do Sul, the southernmost state in Brazil. And we are pleased to welcome today in the early morning meeting Professor Gregory Treverton, our invitee, our guest today, that will be giving us an excellent opportunity to listen to his ideas and his thoughts on national security matters and any other issues he's working with nowadays in terms of research and academic production. Actually, this session is a session of the course we are offering this semester for students, for master's and doctorate students in any other academic program in Brazil, which is called Questioning Mainstream Security Studies. The course is coordinated by Professor Peter Vale, who is a South African, most recognized national security researcher and a researcher for security studies and many other topics in international relations, theory, and so on. So I would like to thank all the people that are with us today, and even the people that will be seeing this interview, this conversation through the YouTube channel of our graduate program. First of all, I would like to introduce Professor Gregory Treverton, and he's an American foreign policy and intelligence executive. He was the chairperson of the U.S. National Intelligence Council from 2014 to 2017, and the vice chair of the same council from 1993 to 1995. He is the senior advisor with the Transnational Threats Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, the most recognized CSIS, and a professor of the practice of international relations and special sciences at the University of Southern Carolina. Earlier, he directed actually the RAND Corporation Center for Global Risk and Security, and before that, its Intelligence Policy Center and its International Security and Defense Policy Center. Also, he was Associate Dean of the Pardee RAND Graduate School. He has served in government for the first Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. He has taught at Harvard and Columbia universities, in addition to RAND, being a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and a deputy director of the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London, most recognized as well by Brazilian scholars and global scholars on international security studies. He holds a B summa cum laude from Princeton University and a MPP, Master's in Public Policy, and a PhD in Economics and Politics from Harvard. So it's a huge honor to welcome Professor Gregory Treverton for our classroom meeting today. And as well, I would like to introduce Professor Peter Vale, who is already a professor at the graduate program, but he needs to be. It's a pleasure to introduce him for the public, because he's a pretty important professor at our department and our graduate program. So we are also honored and always be pleased to introduce Professor Peter Vale. He's a senior research fellow at the Center for Advancement of Scholarship at the University of Pretoria, and from September this year, he's a foreign visiting professor at the graduate program in international relations at the Federal University of Santa Maria. He was the founding director of the Johannesburg Institute of Advanced Studies, and he's a Nelson Mandela Professor of Politics, Emeritus at Rhodes University. Professor Vail has published extensively in a number of fields. These include international relations, Southern African studies, critical security studies, international intellectual history, and higher education. He's the recipient of the International Medal, Utrecht University, the Netherlands, amongst other awards. So sorry for the formality, but thank you very much, professors, for being here with us today. Of course, I represent here the whole community of the Federal University of Santa Maria and Brazilian researchers. So thank you for that. I'll leave you in the room for the conversation on international security questions with Professor Gregory Treverton. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. You want to make a thanks, Greg?
Yes, no, I said thank you very much. After that introduction, I feel like I've peaked and I should just be quiet.
No chance of that happening. So what we thought we'd do is start a conversation, which is a continuation of a conversation we've had for 40 years, maybe, on different aspects of the theory and practice of international relations and security. And then let's talk for 35, 40 minutes. Let Greg and I talk. If you have any questions, write them down, send them to us. And then we can pick up the conversation and let other people into the room. There, as I always say, there are no stupid questions here. Every question has its weight and its importance. Every issue has a role to play in how we understand this amazingly complex world and what we've tried to make of it. And I don't think language should be a barrier either, since Greg Treverton speaks Portuguese. At least he tells me he speaks Portuguese. And I don't speak Portuguese, so don't have a conversation about me without me talking English. So, Greg, thank you for doing this. Really
My pleasure, Peter, as you know.
Really appreciate it. It seems to me that security is such an elusive thing. It stands at the core of the discipline of international relations. But it's such an elusive thing. It's intellectually one thing, it's theoretically something else. And in practice, it's hard and brutal. How do you see this? How do you see security in and of itself? And then how do you see security in the context of the field of international relations?
It's a great question. We always say that when we're not quite sure what the answer is, right? But let me start with an anecdote. Years ago, after the fall of communism, I was at the fall of the Soviet Union. This was the mid-1990s. I was a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York, and I was starting a major project to try and rethink America's role in the world after the end of the Cold War. I wanted to call the project Global Security. In those days, that term was not frequently used. Now it's overused, I suppose. But my chairman of the board, I had an advisory board whose chair was Jim Schlesinger, the former American Secretary of Defense. And Jim said I couldn't use global security in the title of the project. His argument was, he said, security has to be for someone against something. So he said, in those days, that would mean that global security was protecting the Earth from either asteroids or aliens, right? Well, I think I dare say that now we're aware that pandemics and global warming are existential threats. He would probably relax his sense about global security. But I think that his instinct to think of security as for someone against something is probably not a bad way to start. At least it makes it more concrete. my sense, and you've been having this conversation, I know from our conversations, Peter, that it's so easy to expand everything to be a security issue. And I think that's a mistake. So I keep falling back on who are we protecting and against what. That at least makes the conversation for me more concrete and not so ethereal, not so vague. I don't know if that's helpful or not.
Yeah, it is helpful, but how do you theorize the idea of security? I mean, it's such a practical thing, and I know this is a theoretician asking a practitioner a difficult question, but there's been such an expansion of theoretical interest, not all of it sensible, in my opinion, such a theoretical expansion of interest in security. How do you see it theoretically?
Well, I think if you start with the security for whom against what, then you get to then the question is, do you talk of new realms of security? Now it seems to me people are very conscious of health security in a way they weren't before the pandemic, and I think that's probably okay, whether you really want to call that health security, but it is trying to protect people who you care about from something that is a threat. Now, I've for a long time tried to distinguish in the threat world between threats that have threateners attached, right? People that mean you harm, versus threats without threateners. It's really a continuum, you can imagine, a continuum from purposeful people who mean you harm to, as far as we can tell, don't know the facts, but the COVID was unleashed on us by nature, not by accidents of nature maybe, but not with a purposive intent. So I think that's a useful thinking of that distinguishing characteristic of threats is also helpful. And I also hope it's a guard against covering everything with the label security. But you do risk it if you recognize that legitimately health is now an aspect of security, of human security. When you talk about human security, that can be almost anything. So I don't like it being too elastic, but I also recognize that you need to recognize that there are new realms, new threats out there, and new realms which probably deserve the label security. Maybe we could find another label that would help, but it's the one we've got. And again, if you go back to the for whom against what, then that at least provides for me some limits to how far you want to stretch the label security.
So let's park this and come back to it, because right. I think in your readings that you sent us, it seems to me there are 3 issues, and I would like to know how you tie them together. One is intelligence. The second is security, and the third is policy. So let's pull intelligence out and tell me what you think intelligence is and its link to the ideas of security.
For me, intelligence is really basically information and analysis to make better policy. So for me, intelligence and policy are directly related. They're quite different realms, and we in the United States and other places often keep them quite separate in the sense that intelligence is not meant to recommend policy, it's meant to help understand the world. That's a little bit of an artificial distinction, but the logic says intelligence helps policymakers apprehend or understand the world, and then policymakers factor that into their choices, hopefully choices that will enhance or at least protect the security of citizens. So that's the theoretical linkage. For me, I've spent a lot of my career, not a lot, a couple stints at the National Intelligence Council, and there the challenge is making intelligence connect with policy people. This may be slightly an American deformation, but intelligence analysts, we're not talking about analysts, not collectors or operators or not spies. These are people that take all the information, secret and other, that is relevant and try and make some sense of it for the improvement of policy. The challenge is that communication between intelligence and policy, because they tend to be, at least in our culture, very, very different types. The analysts, they want to understand the world better. They tend to take the world as given, think it's not much changeable. Their time horizon tends to be relatively long. In all those respects, they're very different from policy people. An average assistant secretary, working level person in the US government comes in for less than 2 years. So they tend to want to signify, they want to do things. They tend to overestimate the ability of the United States to make changes. They overestimate their own ability to make changes. So it's an interesting, difficult conversation. I sometimes wonder that they communicate at all, but it is that challenge of trying to make information and analysis useful to policy. So I think the logic for me doesn't always work this way, is intelligence trying to understand the world, passing that understanding to policy people who are going to make decisions based on a whole range of things, hopefully including the intelligence, but they've got political stakes and they've got personal ambitions and all sorts of things, making policy to protect national security, coming back to that slightly hoary word.
Are intelligence officers mainly motivated by security and, take it one step further, and threat?
I think so. They're obviously focused on threat. It's said that of intelligence analysts, of intelligence officers, when they see flowers, they think of coffins. So in a certain sense, intelligence is meant to worry about worst cases, about what could go wrong. Again, that distinguishes them from policymakers too, because policymakers are always thinking, hopefully, what might go right? Can I get a good break? Intelligence analysts are more likely to say, well, what could go wrong? What could happen? What could be a bad thing that happens? So they're quite different in that respect as well. But I think the orientation is maybe too much toward threats. Intelligence always talks about doing opportunity analysis to say, now, what are opportunities out there? Where might the United States do something good, enhance something, presumably enhance its own security, but maybe enhance its own security by cooperating or working with others, surely. But there's probably too little of that. And I sort of dislike the term because it suggests that you're mostly focused on threats and opportunities is something special. I think you should be looking across the range at both what are things that could go wrong and what are things that could go right, what are threats and what are opportunities as well. That seems to me inherent in the craft of intelligence. It doesn't always get talked about that way or done that way, in my experience on the inside, but it should be, it seems to me, not just focusing on threats, but also looking at opportunities to actually do positive good.
So there are 4 words that we're talking about: security, intelligence, threat, and opportunity.
And policy, yes.
And policy. But each of them, when we want a cipher, we use the word intelligence, right? Security.
Yes. And I think as you've suggested, it's probably badly overused. And I gather the term securitization has entered the vocabulary. That is putting a security label on everything. I remember doing some work for the World Bank many years ago when Jim Wolfenson was the head of the bank. And he was trying to bring security and development assistance together. But his reason was purely tactical. He recognized that there's huge money in defense and not huge money in development assistance. And so if he could put those two together somewhat artificially, maybe even willfully, he'd have a better chance of unleashing more money for development. In that case, it was purely tactical, I think, because those communities do tend to be sort of skeptical of each other. The development assistance people look at even United States aid, which still goes overwhelmingly to Israel and Egypt, and say, because there's the security link. So they tend to be very skeptical of the use of the word security, fearing that's an opportunity to spend money on things that they don't much care about in the development world.
So let's take these words that we are using, of which there are 5 here, and put them back into this framing about human security. Isn't the central debate between 2 targets or 2 anchors of security? One is the state, and the other are human beings. And often the state and human beings are not the same things. So how do we unpick that puzzle? I mean, you were in South Africa at the time when the state was beating up on its citizens.
Yes.
And they got no security assurance from the state at all. So how do we unravel that little conundrum?
I think it does need to be unraveled. If you think about it, what we call national security these days would have been called in earlier times the state, right? And that does run into the conundrum you just cited, where what about the people? Does the state have an existence independent of the people? That's, in some sense, that's what national security tends to imply, and that I think is erroneous. I don't like that definition of national security as equating it with the state, because as you say, you then get states like the previous one in South Africa that abused people, and lots of states around the world do. That seems to me that's a misuse of national security, conflating it with the state. So that's, again, one of the dangers of talking about security, and particularly national security, I think, is that it does tend to be very state-centric. That's in a world where more and more the private sectors, both for-profit and not-for-profit, are bigger and bigger and more important. It's not as though states are about to go away, but they've got a lot more competition and will continue to have a lot more competition. I often observe that when the Gates Foundation in the United States spends more on health in Africa than the World Health Organization, then our notions of public and private have changed. So one of the defects, it seems to me, of talking about the state and equating that with national security, one is the one you mentioned, that tends to license states to brutalize their citizens in the name of national security. But it also then dramatically underrepresents, it seems to me, citizens, the private sectors, both for-profit and non-for-profit, and single individuals. And if I look at the world, I would say that probably Google is more important as an international actor than, say, Spain. Pick your middle-sized country. And that's a world in which it seems to me national security and the nature of the state are very much up for grabs, and appropriately so.
I want to go back to Wolferson just for a second, because when the Canadians started introducing the idea of human security, they were concerned about development. They were concerned about these kind of issues. Isn't the failure of Wolferson to see that, or driven by his concern that money lay in the military hardware, doesn't that suggest one of the dysfunctions, not only of the conversations about security, but the way we understand society?
I think so. And in some sense, it's easy for sort of traditional military-oriented security types to look at human security and think of it as kind of soft, when in fact it ought to be the name of the game. But because it's so expansive, it goes back to how expansive you want to make the security label. If we're talking about human security, puts humans at the center, which is great, but it also seems to me covers almost anything, right? You can say almost anything is an aspect of human security. And whether that then just drives out all meaning, I think is a fair question.
I mean, isn't really what is going on that the debate on human security has been so planted and even strengthened by the debate on climate change.
Absolutely. I mean, when I think about, remember that famous Earthrise photo, the picture of the Earth from space is now just 52 or 53 years old. When we saw it, it was a kind of inspiration. Now for the world, it's a necessity. It's a necessity to recognize that we share this small little rock in the middle of inhospitable space, and we're slowly extinguishing ourselves on our current track. So that seems to me so I think that even Jim Schlesinger would say, now there is something to global security, because we do share a globe, and in climate change, we will all perish together if we perish. Some will go quicker than others, but on our current track, we'll extinguish ourselves from this lonely rock. So that does give climate change, it seems to me, does give a huge impetus. Pandemics as well, but climate change especially. Pandemics are the existential threat of the short run, but climate is the existential threat of the longer run, and that should make us think of kind of our common security interest. Now, whether we want to call that, certainly security, and I guess I would call it these days global security, though that term has gotten pretty hackneyed as well, but it certainly recognizes that we have a common stake, and that I think is the overwhelmingly most important thing.
But doesn't this concern that we are all in this together on the rock diminish the importance of the state and its security interest? Where does that cutoff point happen? Where
I think
the preponderant question, the great mystery of international relations: when does the state cease to be the state and the world becomes a global world?
I think climate change does drive that home, that it is a global world, and well, we now have to work on this through nation states, but it should, in principle, not be thought of as a state-centered matter. My refrain about this is whatever else the United States and China do, if they don't cooperate on the climate crisis, we are finished. And so somehow that needs to get beyond nation-state interests, and letting other issues about which we have legitimate differences with the Chinese get in the way of cooperating on climate is unacceptable, really. But it's not easy. It's not easy to sort of wall off in our current international system. It's not so easy to wall off one set of issues and say, okay, we're going to cooperate closely on this set of issues, but we're going to compete on this whole other range of issues. That we tend to think of cooperation, seems to me, going the other way, where you start with relatively minor issues and cooperate on those, and then work your way up a sort of ladder to the point where you can cooperate on big issues. So the logic of trying to wall off an immense issue from competitive pressures on other issues, that I think is, for me, a worrisome, probably not doable, and therefore very worrisome. But you're certainly right. At some point, we need to get beyond the notion that there are nation-state interests here to a set of common interests across all humans, not nation-states.
Let me go back to the word security and just ask you to respond to a little idea that occurs to me. If we talk about climate change, is it better not to use the word security in that conversation, because security lends itself so much to the idea of the nation? So can we find another word?
If we could find another word, I think I'd like that, because security does, since it comes out of the notion of the state, it does go in that direction. And also, since we've used it so much from the Cold War onward, it does tend to have a more than faintly military connotation to it, right? It tends to suggest military instruments, not others. And so if we could find others, another word, that would be great. We're probably stuck with something like global security, whatever that means. But if we could find better language, I was struck well, in this last stint inside government by how much words matter. We need words, but they also imprison us. Every time I heard someone talk about the Afghan government, I thought, oof, you had to talk about it, but there wasn't anything resembling a government as we would think of it in Afghanistan. It didn't go very far. And so when you talked about the government, it had a whole set of connotations that didn't apply in Afghanistan. We saw how quickly the government disintegrated under Taliban pressure. But there wasn't much government there. So I'm more and more conscious of how important the words are, because the words are freighted. They do come with connotations, and therefore you need to be careful, it seems to me. And that's security has so much freight on it that if we could find other words, I would like that.
I can't let this moment pass without just remarking or remembering Ken Booth's famous statement at the end of the Cold War. Our work is words, but our words don't work anymore.
Yes, I quote him in my latest book. It's a great thing. I think that's right. I really think that's right. The Cold War had a set of connotations that were mostly not nice, but at least mostly accurate. And that's changed. It seems to be changed dramatically, but our language hasn't changed very much.
Of course, this is a wider change in social science, where the study of language has become so important, philosophy of language. But there's a whole debate in there that I think that international relations and security studies specialists would benefit from that conversation. But
Absolutely.
So let me pick up a term that you use in the papers and sort of try and push you a little on your Americanism. Because you use the word a number of times on a shapeless world. So what is a shapeless world?
I'm really contrasting it with previous worlds. Whatever the Cold War was, there was a shape to it. And I remember having this conversation with soon after 1992 and the end of the Soviet Union, having a conversation in Brazil with a Brazilian diplomat. And he said, now we're sort of lost. He said, before we knew kind of exactly where we were west, but not too far west. We were south, but not too far south. Now we don't know exactly where we are. I thought that was a perfect capturing of the shapeless world. And it seems we were still in that pretty shapeless world. We're moving toward a world that looks like not a new Cold War. That's a terrible locution and a bad description. But we are moving toward a world that's that for the North at least is mostly about loose blocks or loose clubs around China and the United States. Where that leaves the global South still seems to me rather shapeless. And somewhat like the Cold War, it will be an arena for competition for influence. We see that with the Chinese being very active in many parts of the global South, but that still seems to be pretty shapeless. It doesn't have the shape even of the liberal international order of the late last century and early this century. It's still fairly shapeless to me. Am I characterizing it understandably?
So you're characterizing it understanding, but what do you think would help give the world shape?
Well, the question is, I think a shape will emerge. Whether we like the shape that emerges, or I'm not quite sure. I think these, again, talking about the Sino-American dyad or cooperation, I think they will be, obviously, those clubs will be much less bounded clubs than the ones of the Cold War. There'll be much more fence-sitting, switching sides, hedging bets. I think that we see that with the Europeans, particularly with respect to the United States. Now in the Ukraine, there's pretty firm coalition with the Western Europeans. But on other issues, it seems to me there's, China's a really big trading partner for Germany and other European countries. So there'll be a lot of, it seems to me, shifting, hedging, fence sitting. That we've seen already, and even in the coalition against Russia's attack on Ukraine, we've seen the Israelis, the Indians, and others sort of sitting firmly on the fence, maybe voting the right way in the UN, but not doing anything more than that. So that seems to me the kind of world we're moving toward. And it is a very interesting question for me what that means for the global South. Does it again open opportunities to play on the rivalry, or does it merely mean that rivalry gets extended in ways that are unhelpful to poorer countries?
Well, this is such an interesting idea of a shapeless world and the role of people in the shapeless world. And I'm sure that the sort of prefiguration of the world as you've described it will become an industry and scenario building, that kind of thing. But there were attempts to create a different shape of the world prior to COVID. I mean, I think the BRICS idea was an attempt to give Brazil, Russia, India, South Africa, and China some sort of a larger positioning, a larger pole almost in trying to shape a different world.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Let's not get caught up in that, but there have been attempts in the global South to give shape to that world. I mean, regional organizations like in Latin America and in Africa were attempt also to create a form of shape for that world.
Mm-hmm,
so I think there's probably some work and some interesting work to do around that kind of using the idea of a shapeless world as an optic to try and analyze things.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, you can say that the record of most of those regional groupings, except perhaps in Asia, has been pretty unimpressive, but that doesn't mean they aren't worth working on and doing to not just to give shape, but to have some sense of common purpose. The problem with the BRICS idea was the countries were so different. It was hard to imagine them having common interests that they could advance. It turned out, it seems to me, to be mostly a platform for the Chinese to use to expand their conception of the world. In the North, what strikes me is this temptation to talk about Chinese-American relations as a new Cold War. That seems to me to represent the concern that there isn't a shape, to try and impose some shape, right? That the shapeless world is uncomfortable, and therefore people rush to old analogies, old language to try and describe what isn't. You think how different the Sino-American relationship is from the U.S.-Soviet relationship. In those days, we hardly had any economic contact with Russia. It was most years less than 1% of U.S. trade. Now with the Chinese, huge economic interests, and those will continue. And so the idea that this is somehow like the Cold War seems to me to be very unhelpful and probably reflects people's inherent dislike of shapelessness, trying to impose some coherence or shape where probably isn't possible to do that, at least not right now.
It's also lazy borrowing metaphors which are handy and which, like vocabularies, have imprisoned us in certain particular understandings.
Yes, absolutely. No, it's a lazy. For me, it's lazy rather than trying to understand the situation in some complexity. Just slapping a label on it that says, "Oh, this is like that."
Yeah,
I think that is very unhelpful.
So we know that it wouldn't come from serious IR scholars, but only lazy and indolent commentators.
So we hope. Though I think we've seen a few of our scholarly colleagues succumb to that that temptation as well.
Let me return to the security conversation. Do you see yourself as a realist? Or do you see yourself as a critical realist or a questioning realist?
I suppose I'm a deeply questioning realist. I've always been skeptical about that realist approach. as my friend and mentor Joe Nye put it, he says, realism is a place to start. The problem is that realists too often end there. And while it's certainly true that the world is pretty anarchical, it's not totally anarchical. There are some norms and organizations and patterns of cooperation out there. And so stopping at realism is a bad place to stop. I think really realism brings with it three things that I find very unhelpful. It doesn't explicitly do any of these, but it slides easily toward them. One is it tends to be distrustful of diplomacy. You can imagine a good realist saying, yes, if you can enhance state power by diplomacy, that's great. But typically realists focus on, well, if it's give and take and you make the wrong give, you can't recover. You've done something forever. So it tends to be, it seems to me, biased against diplomacy, which is a terrible mistake, it seems to me, in this world, where what ought to be the world after the end of the Soviet Union was ripe for diplomacy, and to ignore that, it seems to me a bad mistake. It also tends, second, to have a zero-sum flavor to it, right? If you're worried about state power, somebody else's gain in power is your loss almost automatically. And that's not true. We see lots of positive sum games out there. We in the United States regret the loss of manufacturing jobs to China, but as China got rich, we Americans got a huge set of cheap goods that improved Americans' lives. So if you go to poor parts of the United States where people used to wear literally rags, they now wear the same sweatsuits and sneakers that the rest of us do, and that's all because of China. China made these.
They speak on iPhones.
Yes, exactly. They wouldn't recognize themselves as beneficiaries of China's rise, but they were.
Yeah.
So taking into account that there are potential for positive sum games out there and looking for them, that is not something that comes easily to realists. The third thing is that it seems to me, again, not necessarily, but it does tend to slide toward military instruments and an emphasis on military power. If you're worried about state power, there are many dimensions to it, but military power is obviously one, and it does tend, if you're worried about the security of the state in an anarchical world, that seems to me does tend to give pride of place to military instruments, and that I think also is a mistake. It seems to me U.S. foreign policy has been very highly militarized for at least a half century or more, and I think that's a mistaken application of realism.
But can you reverse the militarization of American foreign policy?
I don't see, not easily. We know in these very polarized times in the United States that in some ways defense is one of the few things Americans agree on, right? They don't agree on much of else. Even motherhood they don't agree on, but defense they mostly do. And defense plays the game well by spreading contracts across every congressional district. So it's easy for people to vote more money for defense and not for other things. So that does run into lots of other. It's pretty deep. It's what it's what we're good at. We're not always great at it, but we're good at it, and so there's a tendency to use it. I think about one of my students when this was in the bad days in Iraq, 2005 or so, when things weren't going well, and one of my students was a Marine who was in and out of Iraq, and I asked him how things were going, and it was a wonderful line. He said, well, they're asking us to dance the ballet, he said. By that he meant we're trying to build a nation, he said, but we're basically a football team. And while we're pretty good athletes, so we're not terrible at dancing the ballet, but in the end, we're a football team. And I think it's worth remembering that our military is primarily a football team. And if you're playing football, they're good at it. If you're trying to create nations or build stability, the military instrument probably isn't right. One of my other RAND colleagues used to say, if your instrument for nation building is a 19-year-old Kentucky rifleman, you can't no knock on him to imagine that he's not going to have the empathy, the communication skills, and all the rest to be an effective nation builder. So we've tended, it seems to me, to take this military instrument, good football team, and try and make it dance the ballet, and then we're surprised when it doesn't work. Unfortunately, I don't see much hope in dramatically reducing the militarization of foreign policy.
Yeah, there's so many interests, economic and other, in this kind of world.
Absolutely.
And so America's military might in the world may be analogous to the amount of small handguns spread across America.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Igor, I think we've had a conversation now for nearly 15 minutes. Why don't we let some of the students into the room? Let yourself into the room, and let's widen the conversation. Let me remind folks that there is no right or wrong answer here. There's no stupid question.
Only stupid answers. There are no stupid questions, only stupid answers.
Only stupid answers. Okay. So
that's great. So I was just learning with you guys from the conversation, and I would just like to ask the students. They are in the room here on StreamYard website to open their cameras so we can let them in the room. Okay. We already have a question from the chat. Renata Rodriguez asked Professor Treverton to hear more about hierarchical aspects of labeling security, the first topic you were discussing now. Since any threat cannot be a security issue, it's a very specific actors who end up labeling it. How can we think about this authority position of naming security issues?
So if the question is who gets to define an issue as security, is that my understanding of that question? There's several different hierarchies, it seems to me. One is that bother me. One is the sort of traditionalists think of human security issues as kind of soft, not hard. That seems to be a mistake, because we've seen the pandemic killed a lot more people than lots of wars we've fought. So that hierarchy I don't like. The question of who gets to call it a security issue, that's a good one. As my World Bank reference was him trying to say that development is a security issue and not to be treated as important. So that seems to me to be raise the question of who gets to call something a security issue and what does that mean? And there, I think all we should say is care, and goes back to the conversation about not slapping a security label on everything, because it does then tend to introduce some bias, because the security comes with this freight. It has, at least for us, a significant military connotation, and so if you slap it on everything, then you bring with it, it seems to me, all the helpful but also very unhelpful connotations of security. Who gets to do it? Almost anybody can do it, and I think probably it's worthwhile being careful. I was imagining after the pandemic that we'd have a great call for health security, and worried a lot about it. Thought, if we do after the pandemic what we did after 9/11 and create a separate department for health security, that's probably not a good idea. And maybe even thinking of it, health security does take you in the direction of, at least for us, of saying, well, shouldn't we have a government department that does this? Shouldn't we have an intelligence agency that works on this particular issue? And so that's, I think, for me, the risk of applying the security label, even if in some sense it's appropriate, because going back to my for whom against what. We'd like to protect people against pandemic disease. So that seems to me qualifies as a kind of security issue. But whether it's helpful in thinking about it, much less organizing around it, that's for me a much more difficult question.
Professor, I have a question on your academic production when you were at the RAND Corporation producing on a debate about national security power, and I think that was in 2005 or something like that, around that. And I was in the beginning, when I was studying ways to measure national power, as you mentioned, using realism as a place to start. So I was trying to understand differences of a national power and state dash government capacity, and this for global South countries is a pretty important question and a debate. And as you mentioned before, security is a matter of threats to objects, but many global South countries, and Brazil included, are using terms of addressing national security issues or policies, taking the debate on threats to the backstage and adopting a almost generalized idea of capacities. Professor, do you need to answer the call?
Let me just answer and say I'll call right back. Forgive me.
No problem, no problem.
Hey, Mary Jo.
So in the meanwhile, I'll just allow the students to get into the room, okay? We have now Luisa Cassol and Fernanda Silva, two students in the master's program.
What's happened to our Swedish friends?
Sorry, Professor?
What's happened to our Swedish friends?
I believe they are now in a conference. Professor Ada was called for a meeting, but actually she's seeing the transmission, the streaming here on YouTube, but I'm not sure if she will be ready for participating in the room. But guys, if you are students from the course, okay, enroll at the course. If you want to get inside the room, you are very welcome, okay?
I mean, I think we should pick up some of these communication questions that our colleagues, our Swedish colleagues, would like to pick up around the issue.
Great.
Maybe
if Camila and Nada wants to make a question, please feel free to give through text. Okay, just
a power.
Okay, Professor Gregory, you were muted here. Just open your mic again. So the question was the way some countries are addressing security problems, not using a proper analysis of threats and prioritizing threats, but just adopting a general idea of capacity needs or military capacity investments that should be processed or acquired. I wanted to know from you your ideas on the need of addressing threats and the best way of addressing threats in a country or any democratic country, you could say. How can we do that? Should we produce national security strategy documents or addressing through white books on defense or on security? Is that a real need for addressing threats explicitly? And is that a good way of legitimizing, for example, investments in military capacities or security sector modernization, for example?
Again, it's a very good question. I would think that the key for me is, even if you identify something as a threat, and so it's certainly legitimate to say that pandemics are an overwhelming, even existential threat, but calling it a threat then doesn't necessarily mean you want to slide into a familiar pattern of how you spend money, institutions you build. Doesn't necessarily imply you want to have a Department of Health Security. That's the risk, it seems to me, because there's so many connotations to the word security that if you use it, then it tends to carry with it a lot of baggage. And so for me, it's important to distinguish between the nature of the threat and how you respond to it. You know, if you think something is a military threat, then military is a good response. But if this is a threat to health, notice that for at least us in the United States, the first indication of warning of COVID came from a private non-governmental organization, ProMed, not from any government, not from us people in the intelligence business, came from an NGO, and that suggests a wholly different approach to thinking about health, even if you call it a threat. That's got to be something that's deeply public and private, more private than public, probably, at least for us. So I want to distinguish between calling something a threat and how you address that particular threat. You'd started asking a question about power. In the work you cited, I try to distinguish between power and being, which typically is things you can count, militaries, population, economic size, and power and outcome. So we've seen in the United States, we have lots of power and being, but for all that power and being, we were unable over 20 years to produce much of anything useful or stable in the Middle East. So a lot of power and being, not much effective power and outcome. I think that's the beginning. The next step is then to think, how do you think about power in the private sector? You know, as I said earlier about the Gates Foundation in Africa, but how do you think about that form of power as well and factor that into thinking about the international system?
Perfect. Thanks very much. Guys, now we have 3 students from our master's program. So if you want to make questions, please feel free to speak.
Fernando put up a question. Maybe she should ask it.
Okay, just open the mic.
I would like to question how society plays a part into the budget of the U.S. government, because in Ethiopia, what happened during the Cold War was a huge investment in military funds, and the lack of support for infrastructure and health, education, and other things for the society, for the population, made the population turn against the government, and it became a huge threat with the guerrillas and all the other organizations. There was a funding of other states behind these guerrillas, but I would like to question how the society, the pressure of society in the budget and the lack of more budget into things like health and education and other things for survival of their own people makes this concentration and turn into a threat against the state. because then they would be thinking security for their own people, but against their own people. And if there is a kind of coercion, the way the coercion is built in the country that makes it not possible, or if there is something else. I don't know if I explained it well.
Let me just do this and I'll be right back. Sorry. Can I call you right back? I'm teaching a class with Peter. Great question. The easy answer is the political process determines that whatever the political process is, authoritarian or democratic. In our case, we talked earlier about the reason why it's easy to get money for defense, not so easy to get money for other things. Another example for us is what happened after 9/11. People got frightened by terrorism, and we created a new department. We spent a lot of money. I used to outrage people in speeches by saying, notice that you're, as a practical matter, you're more likely to get killed by lightning than by a terrorist. The deaths from terrorism weren't so great, at least away from the battlefields in the United States proper. But that wasn't the public reaction. People were scared. They thought that they could be a victim of terrorists, and even though very few were. So that led us to, in my view, dramatically overinvest in counterterrorism, change the nature of institutions. So it comes back to the political process. I think that my grandchildren will rightly look at me and say, now let me get this right. You had a big recession in 2008. You had interest rates that were nearly zero, and you didn't rebuild American infrastructure, didn't do those things you were talking about inside society that need to get done. We were spending all that money on the war on terror and on the military more generally. Only recently did Biden actually get some serious funding for trying to rebuild American infrastructure. So unfortunately, the answer, I think, comes back to the nature of the political process. In our case, we have a kind of gridlock democracy. Other places may have authoritarian forms that probably naturally tend to want to spend money on the elements of military and police security.
Professor Treverton, taking the opportunity to address these issues, even within a democratic government, for instance, Brazil and other global South or regional powers, we still lack sort of institutions to produce this wider debate with social groups, civil society, and even bureaucratic staff besides military staff to produce decisions on security policies or defense policies. And as I could see, and even your activities in the Committee on Intelligence and the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence in the United States, what kind of institutions or level of organizations could promote this wider debate on options in what you call in this RAND study, conversion, performance, and transformation of resources into capacities to produce what the society wants in terms of security policies? What kind of institutions could you address or highlight that could have the power to broaden the debate with social groups and even intellectual academics such as yourself?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's something we've not done a very good job of. Somebody asked earlier about, would it be useful to have a document that set out a national security strategy across lots of dimensions? I think in some sense that would be a good idea. If you look at ours is mostly hortatory, that is, says things we want to do, it doesn't make trade-offs, and it's heavily oriented toward sort of traditional political, military, international issues. So if you had a document that really said, how important is health by comparison to other issues, that would be a starting point. We really don't have inside the government, and not terrific outside the government either, institutions that do that kind of thinking across domains. You know, our government is pretty stovepiped, as we say, pretty focused on particular issues, each part of it, and working across it. So we have a National Security Council, for which I worked many long years ago, but it too has mostly been concerned with, so shall we say, traditional political, military, international issues. It does have people who are thinking about health and other things, but we need to do a lot more of that and trying to do something as a whole of government. We're not very good at that. I always say the U.S. government can't walk and chew gum at the same time. And what we need is that ability to think much more broadly across the nature of things that concern society. I would like not just health, but that rotting infrastructure in the United States to be sort of explicitly part of the conversation. How do we think about making trade-offs across a wide number of issues? Not good at that, and our Congress is also very stovepiped, very jealous of its jurisdictions, and so even if the executive branch did much better, it would have a hard time selling the results to a Congress that is still very, very stovepiped, traditional ways, and very jealous of its jurisdiction. If you all can do better, that would be great.
I mean, I think one of the issues here is that, and this follows from Fernando's question, I mean, not all military expenditure is bad.
No.
I mean, I think we have to recognize that whatever you think of the internet, that was primarily the result of military expenditure.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that is where the private sector is getting a freebie because all the R&D is being done in the military. So not all military expenditure is bad. And sometimes militaries in disasters can help people in quite significant ways. The Philippines is a good example of this, where military step in when there has been some major disaster. So I think one has to be very careful. Now, if you didn't have military or military expenditure, where would that development and that protection take place?
Yeah, no, it's a good point. And you think about the social effect of the military, and at least in the United States, it's probably the most integrated, the best about gender of any big American institution. So it has a really powerful social effect as well. It's also a way for people to get up in the world, social mobility. So it's in all those social ways an important and impressive set of institutions. And you're certainly right, Peter, that lots of things that we take for granted, like the internet, wouldn't necessarily have happened without some spending on defense. So and lots of military operations are good things as well. So some things have to be done, but again, it's a question of more or less, and the military instead of what.
So I wonder if, Camilla, you had any question from the perspective of your work, which is, maybe you could explain it to Greg first in a few sentences, because it's a slight tangent from the work that we're doing in the course. So could I ask you to do that?
Of course. Are you guys hearing me? Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Yeah?
Yes. Yep.
Yeah. So I'm sorry, I wasn't able to connect before, but now apparently it's everything okay. So thank you so much, professors, for this super interesting conversation. So my work is, I'm a PhD at the Federal University of Santa Maria, and now I am doing an exchange doctorate at Södertörn University in Stockholm, Sweden. And I am studying the Russia-Ukraine war, the coverage of the Russia-Ukraine war on journalistic front pages. And we are trying to deal with the main research question, which is my advisor project, Professor Ada. She's not been able to participate right now because she's had another meeting, but is the topic of the media as a securitizing agent. And my question for you will be in this sense, just to open the debate. We already discussed a bit of this in our last class. It was super interesting. So my question for you will be, how do you see the role of the media related to security issues? I guess that all of these contents of the emergence of social media platforms are complexifying this question.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Again, a really, really good, important question. I think let me start with the war in Ukraine, which seems to be a really interesting set of developments in lots of different ways. One of the most interesting parts for me is the role of intelligence. The United States has gone farther than it usually does in releasing intelligence findings to use them to, in effect, try and control the narrative. And it's been really quite successful. It seems to me it's left Putin sort of on his back foot, reacting, not acting. And because we've said, we know what you're going to do, and we've let the world know. Now, it's easier in the case of Ukraine because so much of the intelligence is imagery, Russian troop movements, and that's mostly unclassified. But still, the United States has released some intelligence about false flag operations, about other things that really, it seems to me, has kept Putin reacting and has controlled the narrative. The other thing that's interesting to me about what hasn't happened in Ukraine is that I would have expected that Russia would have been, doesn't go necessarily to media exactly, but I would have suggested that I would have thought that Russia would have been much more active in the cyber world, trying to do cyber attacks on Ukrainian communications, and they don't seem to have been very active, or at least not very effective. So that's been an interesting development. We know about social media; it's ubiquitous, and we also know that Russia, China, and lots of other places work hard and relatively successfully at controlling it, at least turning it off if they have to, shutting down networks. So in some sense, we were, those of us 20 years ago, when you all were born, would have imagined that social media and the internet would make life harder for authoritarian governments. What we found is those authoritarians have been very good at both controlling media and at using aspects of social media like surveillance to keep a grip on the population. That's been one of the unhappy surprises for me of the last 20 years, that our expectation that dictators would find it harder given the virtual world hasn't turned out that way. That's a sort of indirect answer, I fear, to your question.
Yeah, so here's a question from Zhao. Can you see the question, Greg?
Yeah.
Shall I read it?
Yeah, no, I see it. I think, again, this is a question for I think the answer will vary. I think for us, you can see in the United States, we've moved away from terrorism as a central focus, I think wisely in my view. Whether we are right to focus so much on China, that's another question, but moving away from terrorism. When I was chairing the National Intelligence Council, I understood the political priority to counterterrorism, but I thought it really deformed our work in several ways. It meant when we looked at Nigeria, there wasn't much Nigeria there. We were interested mostly in Boko Haram, the terrorist group. And when we looked at Boko Haram, in a funny way, there wasn't much Boko Haram there either. Not as though we were uninterested in where this movement came from and where it might go, but the imperative emphasis was on finding networks, dismantling them, very tactical in sport. So in that sense, I think that the concentration on terrorism was excessive. Other countries obviously still face a big terrorism problem. Are now, to the extent we have a terrorism problem, it's mostly internal and on the political right, not from Muslims or others. Different countries will have different, seems to me, but in general, I think it may go back up, but the temperature of the terrorism issue has gone down, less threat.
So we've been in this conversation for an hour and 15 minutes. I wanted to know if anybody else had a question to ask Greg, because, yes, Louisa, I'm going to come to you in a minute. Just let me make the point, because I want to go back and do some classwork and let him get on with his day, if that's all right. But I don't want you to say that I deprived you of an opportunity of talking to a practitioner. So, Louisa, off you go.
All right, thank you. So I think it does relate a little bit to what we were talking about with Camilla, but it's about the future of intelligence and dealing with facts. And we live in a time in which we're dealing with an overload of information, of news, of data, of intelligence. So as you mentioned in your work, truth becomes malleable. And I guess I'd like to hear your thoughts about how can security studies, and especially scholars and practitioners, deal with this? How do you think this flood of data will impact security in the broader sense? How will it shape the agenda? Because we can see that some politicians can pick and choose disinformation, some facts, to use it in their favor to further their agenda. So I guess I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
A really scary topic.
Yes.
It is. I sort of put it top of my list. When truth becomes malleable, personal, subjective, indeed, in some sense, what we see is a kind of an assault on the very idea that there can be statements that are empirically invalidated or validated, that there can even be truth. And that's very scary for me. When I think about the role of intelligence, it seems to me that really the only thing intelligence can do is kind of double down and say, we're out there to discover the truth as best we can. If you're interested in the truth, we've got it. If you're not interested, there's not much we can do with you. And that's a worry for me. But I think it does mean, that what's always doing an intelligence function, that is validation. More than once I've had senior policymakers come to me and say, what I'd like you to do is tell me which of the things I read in my New York Times is right and which is wrong. That validation function is, you say, Louisa, with the vast amount of disinformation, misinformation out there, I think that validation function becomes all the more important. And it seems to me it'll be a primary role, at least in my country, for intelligence. It'll be trying to help people who want to sort out what's true from what's not. It is sort of ultimately very worrisome if there is no acceptance that there is truth as opposed to falsehood. That's a very scary place for politics and society to be. And that's kind of where we are now at the moment, with lots of people, denying that there is objective truth out there, that the truth is what they say it is or what they think. And they get reinforced in all the ways we know, not just on social media, but all sorts of other ways as well. Forgive me for taking phone calls. My brother is in hospital, and so I'm trying to decide what I need to do. Do I have to go visit? So forgive me for these phone calls.
So Priscilla has a question.
Yes, my question relates to what Louisa asked, but I'd like to say that following the idea that intelligence is sort of a great story, I would like to know, what do you think about the role or the power of narratives and the constructing of discourses on security, how it has impacted how we see reality and how we label security in itself.
Well, as you know from it, I think you've been good enough to read some of my things. I think narrative and story is critical. Indeed, I think intelligence is mostly about storytelling. A lot of the things we think of as intelligence failures happen when a story gets too firmly believed, and new information doesn't crack into the storyline. The example I use, you probably read, is the Ebola. Medicine had a story about Ebola, and that story was that it was so lethal that people who got it would die before they could infect anyone else. Well, that was the right story, not a happy story, but the right story, until better roads and other forms of rural-urban communication in Africa improved, and that then people didn't die before they could infect anyone else. So that's sort of the chronology of an intelligence failure as well, it seems to me, when people believe something, but the underlying nature changes and the story doesn't. Thinking about how the general narrative, we've talked a lot about, if we put our earlier conversation in terms of narrative, we'd say that it seems to me security, term security, let alone national security, has a kind of narrative to it that may hinder understanding in some of the ways we talked about, or carry connotations that are unhelpful in dealing with new issues, like, for instance, newly important issues like health. But I would think that thinking about the narrative, one of my favorite examples is we have a policy story about North Korea. We've had the same story for 20 years and it hasn't worked. 25 years. The story is, if we just put hard enough sanctions on North Korea, and if we just put enough pressure on the Chinese to get them to put pressure on North Korea, the North Koreans will give up their nuclear weapons. Well, we've had that story, that policy story, for at least 30 years, and it hasn't worked. So trying to change that's not a big narrative, that's a particular narrative with respect to a country, but I think it does show how important these narratives are, and sometimes how hard it is to crack them and create new ones.
So anybody else? Because I want to ask Greg a final question here. And it's a question which I'm sure the students would like to hear the answer to, but they are perhaps too polite to ask the question. What is the best kind of training for a career in this field? And what careers do you think there'll be in this field in the future?
This field being academic study or
academic
security?
Study, international relations, security studies, this kind of area.
I don't know that I have a good blueprint. I mean, it seems to be becoming. Let me start another way. Some years ago, the FBI asked me if I'd do a training program for them for FBI agents, and they wanted two things principally. They wanted me to help them do better at critical thinking and at writing. So I guess I would say the two most important skills out there for almost anything, including international relations, are critical thinking and writing. Then what you add to that, it seems to me, is pretty open. You can add a focus on area studies. I would think increasingly important to at least have some understanding of big data and the use of data. Not everybody's going to be a data scientist, but you need to know enough about that to be a consumer of the work of data scientists. So I would say that's a semi-imperative. And then beyond that, what you want by way of area studies or economics or the kinds of, we're still stuck with disciplines. So the kinds of things that disciplines offer that you would like to specialize in as you work in international relations. So I guess I'd start with critical thinking, writing, and enough understanding of data and data manipulation to be a consumer of it, at least.
Well, thanks. I don't know if Igor wants to express the thanks of the
Well, no, thank you.
University, but thank you, my friend.
Thank you. And thanks to the students. Good luck to all of them.
Thanks very much, Professor Gregory Treverton. For us, it was a huge pleasure to hear your thoughts, your brilliant ideas. Thanks very much for your kindness.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Igor. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. See you next time.
We are going to have a little talk in the group. Igor?